then it will turn off. So the low pressure fuel pump's working, the high pressure fuel pump's working because it runs, but the fuel control module is the one that decides when it should inject fuel at right times.
The story of the Bugatti Veyron and Matt Armstrong is not just about a car breaking down. It is about pride, challenge, and the clash between a world-famous manufacturer and an independent builder who refuses to accept limits. It all begins with a moment that changed everything. A high-speed attempt that was meant to prove something powerful. Matt had already built a reputation online for doing things most people thought were impossible. He was not a professional Bugatti factory engineer, but he had managed to fix complex problems using simple tools, patience, and knowledge from the wider Volkswagen Group system. He had repaired expensive components using cheap alternatives, proven that many high-end parts are shared with more affordable cars, and shown his audience that not everything requires factory-level pricing or support. This made him popular, but it also placed him in a unique position where every project he touched became a challenge to the traditional automotive world. The Bugatti Veyron project was the biggest of all. It was not just another car rebuild. It was a statement piece. A Veyron is one of the most advanced and expensive engineering machines ever created, designed with extreme precision, massive power, and systems that most garages would never attempt to touch. When Matt started working on it, many people doubted he could even get it running properly, let alone make it roadworthy for long trips. But step by step, he proved those doubts wrong. He repaired issues, replaced parts, and brought the car back to life in ways that surprised even experienced viewers. The audience watched as he turned a damaged supercar into something that could actually move under its own power again. This alone would have been enough for most creators, but Matt's goal was higher. He wanted to take the car beyond just being fixed. He wanted to prove that it could survive real-world driving, not just short test runs or controlled environments. That is where the Europe trip idea came from. It was meant to be a celebration of all the work done, a journey across roads that would show the world that independent repair could stand against factory authority. Everything seemed ready. The car had been repaired, upgraded, and visually restored with careful attention. Even small details like wheels, paint protection film, and interior touches had been improved. On the surface, it looked like a finished project, a success story ready to be shared. But beneath that surface, something was still not right. A hidden problem inside the fuel system, specifically the fuel pump control module, was quietly waiting. At first, there were no obvious signs. The car could still run, still move, still behave normally under certain conditions. But complex machines often fail in unpredictable ways, and the Veyron is no ordinary machine. It is controlled by advanced electronics that communicate across multiple systems, and when one part misbehaves, it can affect everything else. That hidden issue would eventually reveal itself at the worst possible moment, during the exact type of high-pressure situation that tests both machine and driver. And when it did, it changed the entire direction of the story. What was supposed to be a victory journey across Europe suddenly turned into a stalled project, leaving everyone watching with one major question. Had the independent builder finally reached a problem that could not be solved alone? The moment everything changed came during what was supposed to be the most exciting part of the entire project. A high-speed attempt on a runway that would prove the Bugatti Veyron was not just repaired, but fully capable of performing at the level it was designed for. This was not meant to be a casual drive or a simple test. It was a carefully planned moment where performance, engineering, and confidence would all be pushed to their limits. The car had already completed a long drive to reach the location, covering a significant distance without major issues, which at that point felt like a strong sign that the rebuild was successful. The engine, gearbox, and major systems were all behaving normally, and everything seemed stable enough to attempt something more extreme. But high-performance machines often hide their problems until stress exposes them, and that is exactly what happened here. As the attempt began to build momentum, something unexpected occurred deep within the electronic control system. Without warning, the car shut down in a way that was both sudden and complete, cutting power at the exact moment when everything should have been at its peak. There was no gradual decline, no obvious warning sound, and no slow degradation in performance that could have been noticed earlier. Instead, it was a clean and immediate failure that left the entire system inactive. For anyone watching, it looked almost unnatural, as if something invisible had interrupted the process. For Matt, it was even more confusing. because this was not the type of failure that usually comes from mechanical stress alone. Mechanical issues often give signs: noises, vibrations, temperature changes, or reduced performance. But this was different. It felt like an electronic decision had been made somewhere inside the system, stopping the car instantly. The fuel pump control module became the main suspect, as it plays a critical role in managing fuel delivery and engine operation. If that system fails or behaves incorrectly, the engine simply cannot continue running, no matter how strong or well-built everything else is. What made this moment even more serious was the fact that it did not appear to be a simple part failure that could be easily replaced and fixed. Instead, it suggested a deeper issue, possibly related to coding, software communication, or a system-level fault that requires specialized diagnostic tools. This is where the complexity of modern supercars becomes clear. Unlike older vehicles, where most problems can be solved with basic tools and replacement parts, a car like the Veyron depends heavily on software control systems that interact in tightly controlled ways. If one part of that system stops communicating properly, the entire car can become unusable. After the shutdown, the situation did not improve. Even attempts to restart or reset the system did not bring the car back to life. What had started as a promising high-speed test quickly turned into a complete breakdown scenario, leaving the project in an uncertain state. The car that had just successfully driven long distances suddenly became immobile, creating a sharp contrast that made the failure feel even more dramatic. This moment marked the beginning of a new phase in the story, one where success was no longer the focus. Instead, attention shifted to solving a problem that did not behave like a normal mechanical fault. And as the days passed without a clear fix, it became increasingly obvious that this was not going to be a simple repair job. After the sudden shutdown, the entire direction of the project changed from celebration to investigation. What was supposed to be a confident Europe road trip turned into a situation where the car could not even reliably start or run. This shift created a very different atmosphere around the build, because now every small detail mattered much more than before. The focus moved away from visual upgrades and completed modifications, and instead moved toward one critical question. Why did the car fail at such a specific and unusual moment? The fuel pump control module issue became the center of attention, but even that label did not fully explain what was happening. In many normal car problems, identifying a faulty part is the hardest step, and once that is done, the solution is usually straightforward. You replace the part, test the system, and the car returns to normal operation. But in this case, things were not following that expected pattern. The issue did not disappear after initial checks, and the car remained unstable or completely non-functional, which suggested that the problem might not be purely hardware-based. This raised the possibility of deeper electronic or software-related complications, something that is far more complex in modern supercars like the Bugatti Veyron. These cars are not just mechanical machines. They are integrated systems where hardware and software constantly communicate. If that communication is interrupted or restricted, it can create failures that are difficult to diagnose without manufacturer-level tools. At the same time, the situation sparked wider debate among viewers and automotive enthusiasts online. Many people began discussing whether independent builders can realistically maintain and repair such advanced vehicles without factory support. Matt had already built a reputation for proving that many expensive repairs could be solved using cross-reference parts from the Volkswagen Group, cheaper components, and careful diagnosis. He had shown that airbags, sensors, and even gearbox-related issues could sometimes be resolved without paying extreme dealership prices. This gave confidence to his audience that high-end cars were not completely locked behind manufacturer control. However, the Veyron situation introduced a new type of challenge, one that seemed to go beyond simple part replacement. This is where the narrative around gatekeeping began to grow stronger. Some viewers believe that certain systems in modern supercars are intentionally designed to require official dealership tools, making independent repair more difficult or even impossible in specific cases. Others argue that the complexity of the system is simply a result of engineering requirements for safety and performance, not a deliberate attempt to restrict access. This disagreement created tension in the discussion surrounding the project, because it was no longer just about fixing a car. It was about proving whether independence in automotive repair has real limits. Meanwhile, Matt continued trying to find a solution, but the problem did not present itself clearly. There was no simple warning code that pointed directly to a single replaceable part, and no obvious physical failure that could be visually confirmed. Instead, the issue remained hidden within the system, making every attempt at diagnosis slower and more uncertain. This uncertainty is often the most frustrating part of advanced mechanical or electronic troubleshooting, because progress becomes difficult to measure. Each test either leads to no change or raises more questions instead of providing answers. As time passed, the situation began to feel less like a normal repair and more like a technical standoff between independent problem-solving and manufacturer-level system control. And that tension is what pushed the story into a much larger narrative than just a broken car. As the fault remained unresolved, the situation naturally moved into a more serious phase where outside support became unavoidable, at least in discussion. This is where the story began to take on a completely new direction, because the idea of contacting Bugatti was no longer just a theoretical suggestion from viewers, but something that started to feel increasingly realistic within the context of the problem. The key issue was not simply that the car had failed, but that it failed in a way that did not respond to the usual repair methods that had worked before. In earlier parts of the project, Matt had successfully dealt with problems by using cross-reference Volkswagen Group components, replacing faulty parts with more accessible alternatives, and carefully diagnosing electrical faults using standard tools. That approach had worked on multiple occasions, and had become a central part of his reputation. It created the impression that even extremely expensive and complex cars could be brought back to life without relying entirely on manufacturer systems. However, the current issue did not fit neatly into that pattern. The fuel pump control module problem seemed to sit in a category that might involve deeper software communication or proprietary diagnostic access, something that is not easily replicated outside official systems. This created a clear turning point in the narrative, because it introduced the possibility that independent repair might have limits after all. At the same time, the online discussion around the project intensified. Viewers began analyzing every detail of the failure, comparing it to previous successes, and debating whether this was a normal technical breakdown or something more unusual. Some argued that modern supercars are fundamentally dependent on manufacturer-level systems, meaning that certain faults will always require official intervention. Others believe that with enough knowledge, persistence, and creativity, even these complex systems can eventually be understood and repaired independently. This debate added another layer of tension to the situation, because it turned a single mechanical problem into a wider question about automotive control and accessibility. Meanwhile, the emotional weight of the situation also grew. The car was not just a machine in a workshop. It represented months of work, documentation, problem-solving, and public expectation. Every stage of the build had been shared and analyzed by an audience that had followed the progress closely. So when the car failed in such a dramatic and unexplained way, it did not feel like an isolated incident. It felt like a turning point in a long-running story that had built up a strong sense of momentum. The idea of reaching out to Bugatti introduced a sense of irony into the situation, because it contrasted sharply with the earlier narrative of independence and self-reliance. The same project that had been used to demonstrate alternative repair methods was now potentially dependent on the very manufacturer it had challenged. This contrast is what made the moment so significant, because it highlighted the complexity of the situation in a very clear way. It was not simply about pride or competition anymore. It was about whether a highly advanced technical problem could be solved without access to the original engineering ecosystem. And as that question became more central, the direction of the story began to shift toward uncertainty, where the outcome was no longer predictable based on past success. As the situation developed further, attention shifted from the fault itself to what would happen if official manufacturer support was actually required. This is where the story gained a new level of tension, because it was no longer just about diagnosing a technical issue. It was about whether access, permissions, and corporate control would influence the outcome of a real-world repair. In previous experiences, many viewers had already seen situations where independent attempts at sourcing parts or technical support from manufacturers did not go smoothly. Requests for components, small hardware items, or technical information had often been redirected toward authorized service centers, where pricing and procedures were fully controlled by the manufacturer's network. This pattern had created perception among some viewers that certain high-end automotive brands maintained strict control over their systems, making independent repair difficult in specific cases. Whether this perception is fully accurate or not, it became an important part of how people interpreted the current situation. If the fuel pump control module issue required software-level diagnostics or proprietary coding access, then it could fall into exactly the kind of category where independent tools are limited. That possibility added pressure to the narrative, because it meant the solution might not depend on mechanical skill alone, but on access to restricted systems. At the same time, there was also a more practical reality to consider. Modern supercars like the Bugatti Veyron are built with extremely advanced electronic architecture designed for performance, safety, and precision. These systems often rely on encrypted communication between modules, and without the correct diagnostic equipment, it can be very difficult to determine the exact cause of a failure. In such cases, even highly skilled independent builders may reach a point where guesswork is no longer effective and official diagnostic pathways become the only reliable option. This is where the story began to balance between two interpretations. On one side, there was a belief that independent repair had already proven itself repeatedly throughout the project, showing that many expensive and complex issues could be solved without factory intervention. On the other side, there was a reality that certain systems may be fundamentally tied to manufacturer infrastructure, making full independence difficult to achieve in every scenario. This contrast created uncertainty about the final outcome, because both arguments had some level of validity depending on how the problem was understood. As discussions continued, the focus also shifted toward what a potential response from Bugatti would look like. Based on previous situations involving high-end automotive support, many assumed that any official involvement would likely require the vehicle to be brought to an authorized facility, where diagnostic procedures, repairs, and pricing would be handled under manufacturer guidelines. This possibility created a strong sense of irony in the story, because it would place the project back into a controlled environment after months of independent progress. However, it was still not confirmed whether such a step would actually be necessary. The uncertainty itself became part of the tension, because the outcome depended on whether the issue could be solved independently or whether it would cross a threshold that required official tools. This is what made the situation feel like a turning point rather than just another repair challenge. The story was no longer about what had already been achieved, but about what would happen next when independent methods potentially reached their limit. And that question began to define everything that followed. At this stage of the story, the situation had fully evolved from a simple technical breakdown into something much larger, almost symbolic in nature. The Bugatti Veyron was no longer just a car sitting in a workshop with an unresolved fault. It had become the center of a wider debate about control, access, and the real limits of independent engineering. Every previous success in the project had built confidence that complex automotive systems could be understood and repaired without depending entirely on manufacturer support. That belief had been reinforced through multiple fixes, including electrical issues, part replacements, and cross-referencing components across the Volkswagen Group ecosystem. Each solved problem had strengthened the idea that knowledge and persistence could overcome even expensive engineering barriers. But now, with the fuel pump control module issue still unresolved, that belief was being tested in a very different way. Unlike earlier challenges, this fault did not present itself in a clear or predictable manner. There was no simple part number to replace, no obvious mechanical failure to repair, and no straightforward diagnostic path that led directly to a solution. Instead, the issue appeared to sit deeper within the vehicle's electronic communication system, where multiple control units interact constantly to manage performance, safety, and efficiency. In such systems, a single fault can sometimes prevent the entire vehicle from functioning, even if every mechanical component is perfectly intact. This type of failure is particularly difficult because it removes the usual problem-solving steps that independent builders rely on. Without full access to manufacturer-level diagnostic software, coding tools, or internal system data, the problem becomes significantly harder to isolate. This is where the tension in the story reached its peak, because it forced a confrontation between two realities. One where skill, creativity, and persistence can solve almost anything, and another where certain systems may require official infrastructure to fully understand. At the same time, the emotional weight of the project continued to grow. The car represented months of effort, documentation, and public expectation, and every update had been followed closely by an audience invested in its success. This made the unresolved issue feel more significant than a typical repair delay, because it affected not just the builder, but also the narrative that had formed around the entire project. The idea that the project might now require manufacturer assistance introduced a shift in perception, not because it confirmed failure, but because it challenged the assumptions built throughout the process. It raised the question of whether independence in automotive repair has defined boundaries that cannot be crossed, or whether those boundaries are simply not yet fully understood. This uncertainty is what gave the situation its intensity. It was no longer about proving a point in a single repair. It was about testing the limits of what independent engineering can realistically achieve when faced with highly integrated modern systems. And as the story moved forward, the outcome remained unresolved, leaving only anticipation for what direction the next step would take. In the end, the story of the Bugatti Veyron and Matt Armstrong does not settle into a simple victory or defeat, because the situation itself refuses to be that clean. What it leaves behind is something more interesting and more realistic: uncertainty in a world that often tries to force clear answers. The car still represents one of the most ambitious independent rebuilds